Let me mute this. So, the 49ers are currently playing, so I was watching that. So, how are you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. How about you?
Pretty good. The Niners are in overtime, which is, they kind of suck this year, but, I mean, good for them, they made it. But anyway, so they're probably going to lose. They just fumbled the ball, so the other team has taken over. Or they might tie, so it's suck a team. Anyway, so the topic for this discussion here is that absolute truth is unknowable, and appeals to objective or absolute truth should not be considered accurate. Now, let me break down what I mean by that first. The concept of absolute truth is that there is a fabric, a metaphysical fabric, that has answers to all that is right or wrong. And this would be absolute truth, as opposed to what humans can rationally say is true. We, with our finite minds, can come to things that we think are true. But the idea of absolute truth is that there is a metaphysical fabric that says with certainty that this is black, this is white. And then when there are gray areas, that there is a specific yes or no answer to those gray areas. Now, my contention is that even if that concept of absolute truth and absolute morality exists, humanity is finite. We can't know the actual answers to that absolute truth because in order to know the answers to everything, you would necessarily have to be infinite. So the idea of a God would be able to know such absolute truth. But the idea of humans is that because we are limited to our own senses and our rationality, we cannot know that which is infinite. We might be able to grasp that something is infinite, but we would not know the infinite possibilities in and of themselves. This is because we are human. Now, this leads to the second part, which is that appeals to objective or absolute truth should not be considered accurate. You will hear some, usually it's religious people, but sometimes sometimes it can be agnostics or atheists, will say, because absolute truth exists, therefore, and then they make a claim off of that. But if you are making a claim off of something that you cannot yourself fully know, then that would be an irrational claim. So my overall contention is that absolute truth may or may not exist, but regardless, humans would not be able to know it because we are finite, so we should not be making appeals to it in logic or in discussion.
Okay, thanks. That was I'm thinking that. Do you think that problem's on my end or your end?
Let me see if my it says I'm connected to the right Wi-Fi. Usually when I'm connected to this Wi-Fi, I have a really good connection.
Okay. Now it seems to be working for me.
Okay.
Okay, thanks so much. And yeah, I'm really excited to be discussing these weighty epistemological issues with you today. I think a couple definitions are in order so that we can really crystallize what we're talking about with the resolution. Would you agree that absolute really is referring to some kind of universal, that something that applies to every single person in every time, in every place, every square inch of the cosmos?
Yes.
Okay. And truth would be like that which corresponds to reality, suspending any definition of whether or not we can actually know reality, but truth would be that which corresponds to something else, something in reality.
To a certain extent, yes. I think truth is that which we can show to be true. Sorry, that's a circular definition. It'd be that which we can verify.
Okay, and that process of verification would be comparing whether or not something aligns with reality.
Yes.
Okay.
Usually. There can be other ways of knowing it, but yes.
Okay. And the one sort of like framework point I want to make here is that truth is a quality of propositions, not of objects. I'm not going to say that my water bottle is true. That's a nonsensical statement. That truth is something that we use to describe a statement or a claim. Like my water bottle is blue. That's something that we can test the validity of. So it's a proposition. It's a truth claim.
Or the statement that my water bottle exists. You could make that.
Okay, so I think my essential contention here. Oh, and before I go any further, I think it'd be prudent to bifurcate this resolution into its two segments. So we have the antecedent clause, absolute truth is unknowable. I want to deal with that first, and then maybe spend the latter half of this debate addressing the rest of the resolution. So centering on absolute truth is unknowable. I think that this is quintessentially a proposition. And if we're going to go with Aristotle's categorization of propositions, it's a certain kind of proposition. It's what's known as a universal negative. Aristotle would have phrased it as no truth is knowable. And the reason why he called such a proposition a universal negative is because, one, it's negative, it makes a denial, but then secondly, it's a universal because it applies to every person, in every place, in every time period, in every square inch of the cosmos. I'm essentially saying that the statement absolute truth is unknowable is an absolute that you are professing to know, which would then be self-referentially absurd.
This is a common argument that people make, usually Christians make, when it comes to the concepts of you can't say nothing is possible because that would mean you're making a statement in and of itself that something is possible. Or, you hear that argument a lot. When I'm saying absolute truth is unknowable, I'm not saying there is no absolute truth. There may be absolute truth. I'm saying that humanity, even if absolute truth exists, would only be able to grasp certain elements of it that are possible with our finite minds. We would not, by definition, like even if we accept the concept of a creator, we are necessarily less than that creator. I don't think either you or any other Christians would make the claim that we know all that is in the mind of that creator. That's what I'm going for here. That creator would know all that is here, all that is past, all that is present, all that is future. He knows all location. He knows everything because he is infinite. And in part of this infinity, he would know the moral fabric of what is or is not true. But humanity, because we are lesser than him, are unable to do that. We might be able to come to certain answers on what we would consider true, but we wouldn't be able to know his absolute truth, if that makes sense.
Okay, so you say that the self-referential absurdity argument is a common argument. What's your response to it?
It wasn't that a response to it? I'm not sure.
Okay, well, here's what I see that what you just said sort of falls down into you're conflating two, you're doing two illicit issues of conflating. So first of all, you're conflating extraneous metaphysical issues with this question of epistemology. The resolutions, and I believe you wrote the resolution, right?
Yeah.
The resolution's not asking us whether or not we can somehow know the depths of the mind of God if there is a God, and it's not asking us if we can know the entirety of truth if absolute truth exists. It's asking us whether or not we can actually know absolute truth. And I'm saying that the statement, absolute truth is knowable, that's a proposition that its truth value can be measured. Is it true or is it false? If we say that absolute truth as unknowable is true, then it is a universal statement, making it absolute truth, rendering itself referentially absurd. So I think that talking about the discussion of God, if we want to go into God later, I'd be happy to. I'm just saying, like, at the forefront, if we're addressing the resolution itself is self-referentially absurd. We can obviously know a truth if absolute truth is unknowable. The second thing that I think you're conflating here.
Before you go on there, let me just go. I think that you're getting to that position because in your definitions, you were just going with absolute and truth, as opposed to the common statement which is made of absolute truth. The question that I'm getting at here is, can we appeal to the absolute fabric of morality, the metaphysical idea that there is a black and white answer to every single moral question? Can we appeal to that as part of our reasoning in answering questions? That's what I'm going for. I'm not saying there aren't truths. There are things that we can know to certain levels of truth. But that's a different idea than the idea that many people reference of absolute truth.
Okay, I think I understand your point. And I'd be happy to address the second issue I believe you're conflating here underneath this. But like stepping back and examining the resolution, this is an epistemological question, not an ethical question. And every statement you're making is applicable to the philosophical realm of ethics, which is dealing with what we should and should not do. Epistemology is concerned with how we know and what we know. Absolute truth is unknowable. Appeals to objective and absolute truth should not be considered accurate. These are solely epistemological concerns. And yes, epistemology does precede ethics, so you're going to need some kind of epistemological framework to make ethical claims. But I don't think that ethics is necessarily a component of this resolution.
I think the second part of it is certainly ethics. That's why I'm using both. The first part, the idea that absolute truth is unknowable, is epistemological. But the second part, and you're right, we should address both of these separately. The second part is what you do with that. And that would be where ethics come in. Can we appeal to this concept of absolute truth in ethics? Which is what the reason that I created this resolution is because I see a lot of Christians, even here on CallOut, appealing to absolute truth as, oh, look, absolute truth must exist. There must be a moral fabric. Therefore, and then they go into their argument. But they don't prove the first point, which is that absolute truth not only exists, but that we know it, or that we can know it. I'm interested in what the proofs would be for how not only absolute truth exists, but that we finite beings can know it. Then you get into the ethics part.
Okay, I see what you're saying. I think you've inextricably interrelated truth and morality, and I guess I'm saying I believe those are two distinct entities.
Okay,
so,
how do you get to that?
So, for example, a moral claim like murder is wrong, that's a proposition, right?
Sure.
It's a statement. And we can compare that to some kind of reality. Isn't that right?
Yeah. With what we have as humans, we would use rationality, we would use our senses, we would sometimes use faith. Yes.
Okay. And what you're saying is we can't know that reality, so we can't make that comparison.
No, no, I'm saying we cannot know the metaphysical answers to everything in the universe. We can't know that. Do you think we can know that?
I'm sorry?
Do you think that we humans can know the answers to every single gray issue?
No.
Why not?
I don't think that voting con on this resolution entails that finite beings have to have a grasp of infinite truth. Because the resolution, an epistemological question, says absolute truth is unknowable, which is, if we're referring back to philosophical history, this is like the Pyrrhonian skeptic position on epistemology, that you can't know any kind of truth. I'm saying you can know truth because the statement absolute truth is unknowable is self-referentially absurd. I think that we came into this debate with two different notions of what the connotations of the resolution are.
Yeah, I think.
And I'm taking literally as an epistemological debate, and you're importing your preconceived ethical presuppositions into this.
To a certain extent, I would agree with that. The definition of absolute truth I was using is the one that is commonly handed about here on CallOut, which may or may not be correct. We can talk about that definition and everything, but I'd rather not get into a definitions debate and everything. I'm more interested in the question of, can humans know the metaphysical answers to all of these gray moral issues, and what we would do with that information one way or the other?
Okay, well, I apologize for the fact that this is my second CallOut debate ever.
Right.
So I didn't know that this resolution was birthed from a understanding of the preceding CallOut debates.
Yeah.
So I was shouldn't.
Now this is why we go over definitions and everything. So let's meet on these two definitions. And the thing is, neither of us needs to win or lose this, because that's the nice thing about just the 45-minute discussion format. There's no reason to win or lose. We can just talk about it. So how do we verify that which exists in this world? How do we come to knowledge of truth? What would you say we can know as truth, and how do we come to it?
Good question. Well, I'd say the proposition a triangle has three sides is absolutely true.
Absolutely. Okay. If it is absolutely true, that would imply 100.0% certainty.
Right.
Is it possible in any way that your mind has been misled to believe triangles have three sides? Is it possible that here people would point to the Matrix or that you could be in a video game, or you might be a planet who's been made to think that you are something. And in the rules of that universe that you are in, triangles appear to have 3 sides, but in reality, maybe triangles actually have 8 sides. Can you disprove that with 100% certainty?
Well, I can't say I'm an avid video game player, but in every single video game I've played, triangles do have 3 sides. I think that it's an a priori argument. The definition of triangle is a 3-sided shape.
According to the rules of this universe, yes. But the question is 100% certainty. We're talking, when we talk about absolute truth, we're talking about 100% certainty. Can you prove with certainty that I exist? 100% certainty.
I don't know if I can prove with 100% certainty, but I do think I can prove with 100% certainty that there is at least one absolute truth that is knowable. Because if we're going to go with the resolution, the statement absolute truth is unknowable, that would be an absolute that we're claiming to have knowledge of.
Would it be possible to say that certain individual truths could be known absolutely? I think that could be said. I think there would be one truth we could say with absolute certainty is true, which is, I think, therefore I am. By the fact that I exist, by the fact that I am currently thinking, I know that I exist in some manner or another. I may be a lamp who's been turned into something that makes me think that I'm a human. You might not exist. Who knows? I can't prove it 100% one way or the other. But by the fact that I think and am having thoughts, I know that in some way or another, I do exist. I would agree with you that we can know that truth absolutely. But here again, we come back to just the question of what are we defining as absolute truth? You're simply saying we can know some things with absolute certainty, but that's different than the concept of absolute truth, at least the one that I'm talking about.
Okay, well, your definition of absolute truth, a fabric that has the answers to everything that's right and wrong, you're talking about the breadth of knowledge in its entirety, every single conceivable thing we could know.
Yes.
So your definition of absolute truth includes the entire gamut of knowledge.
Yes, which is what a God would know. A creator, an infinite being, any form of infinite being would have that infinite knowledge. But a finite being who is within his world would not know that. For instance, if we are in a matrix world right now, we cannot know everything that is actually true because we're being made to see something entirely false. We can't disprove that either. In the same way that the God may know every single moral rule about our universe, but we finite beings would be unable to know that.
Well, suspending the notion that we're even in the matrix, let's just interpret reality in a commonsensical way. Like, we are living in our reality. No finite being can know the infinite gamut of knowledge. Like, that's impossible. And I agree with you on that. So yeah. in order to vindicate myself for any of the viewers that are watching, I didn't come into the debate interpreting the statement absolute truth is unknowable as a statement about absolute truth somehow meaning infinite knowledge. Like, I'm interpreting this from my history in studying philosophy as this is an epistemic question.
Sure. I understand that, and this is why I don't care if I win or lose. Whatever, we'll just take your definition, because why not? According to that definition, I would agree with you that there are certain things that can be known absolutely. I don't think that's the same concept as absolute truth. But again, this is just different people using different words to define the same meaning. But we know what each other are talking about. According to your definition, I would agree there are certain things, like at least one thing, that can be known with absolute certainty, which is, I think, therefore I am.
Okay, so you're essentially articulating the Cartesian position then.
To a certain level, yes.
Okay, well, if we can know our own personal existence with absolute certainty, then I'd say that that is a knowable absolute truth.
Yes, it is a thing that we can know with absolute certainty. I mean, we're playing with words here. But yeah, I mean, sure, we can agree on that. We can know that.
Sure.
So where does this leave us then? So we can know that with absolute certainty. We can know 100% on at least one issue. But with nearly anything else in the universe, we would not be able to know it with 100% statistical certainty. Would you agree with that concept?
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that concept. And I'm a little confused as to the burden of 100% certainty. Is knowing something beyond a reasonable doubt, like in the courtroom standard, wouldn't that be sufficient? I guess I don't understand the need for 100% certainty for all kinds of absolute truth.
It would be knowable, it would be true to a reasonable degree of certainty, but it would be different than the concept of absolute truth. Because the whole idea of absolute truth is that there is a metaphysical answer, which would be black or white. If we can prove things to 99% certainty, that's still not absolute truth. We finite beings cannot come to that 100% certainty. That's what we're, see the difference there?
Yeah, I do. And I'm going to concur with you on the fact that finite beings cannot have infinite knowledge.
Right.
Reality.
Right.
Now that I think that we've both agreed with each other under our interpretations of the and different approaches, I want to probe what you're talking about then with right and wrong. Let's talk a little about morality, because I'm interested to see where you're pursuing this concept. Give me some tangible, concrete examples of what you're talking
about. With regards to morality, in what way?
Yeah, like we can't know moral precepts for like true or false. Like you said that we can't have absolute knowledge about moral commands. Like give me an example of like some kind of moral law that you don't think we can have absolute knowledge of.
Well, I think you saw the discussion I had with Siegfried last night, where we talked about the whole concept of natural rights. Natural rights are things that many people appeal to as, oh, there is a God, there is absolute morality because there is a God, and therefore we must have natural rights. But as finite beings, we would be unable to prove that with certainty. We could point to it as a possibility, but we would not be able to point to it as a certainty or as an absolute truth. We could point to it as a potential truth, but not as an absolute truth.
Okay, I think I see where you're coming from on that. I mean, I don't have any responses. I haven't thought to an extensive degree about natural rights, and I certainly wasn't preparing in terms of like ethical considerations for this debate. So
sure. So let's I'll just take a step back then. I mean, we don't need to focus on the same things I was thinking about. Let's talk about what you were thinking about. What was your overall concept? What is it you're looking to prove here?
Sure. Well, the statement "absolute truth is unknowable" is self-referentially absurd because it posits knowledge of an absolute truth. I think we established that. Secondly, appeals to objective or absolute truth should not be considered accurate. I'm curious as to know what you mean by accurate.
100% certainty.
Okay, so you know with 100% certainty that appeals to objective or absolute truth should not be considered accurate.
I do not know.
Okay, so okay.
So ultimately, it is a question of if absolute truth exists, and it may exist, how much of it can we know, and how do we come to know it?
Right.
It's entirely possible that it does exist.
Right.
But as finite beings, let's say we're not in a matrix world, but let's say there is a God who created this universe. We have no way of knowing what he knew when he first created this universe. All the rules that we follow, all of the levels of rationality or our senses that we use to come to knowledge, that's all we have. But these will be limited. So we cannot reach the same answers that he would come to. We might be able to say certain things to a high degree of certainty, but other than the statement that I think, therefore I am, we would not be able to know it with 100% certainty. So obviously you and I have different definitions of the whole concept of absolute truth and everything, but at least the one I was operating under was the idea that we can know metaphysical questions and moral answers, because absolute morality and absolute truth I consider to be essentially the same concept. So would you, I know that you were not thinking about ethics and everything, you were more thinking about epistemology and everything, but would you agree that those two are rooted in the same concept, the idea of absolute truth and absolute morality.
Well, it all depends upon what kind of like philosophical narrative is guiding your beliefs. My position on truth that I clarified before is truth defined that which corresponds to reality, and that it's something that describes propositions. So we have this monolithic notion here of absolute truth, absolute morality. I'm saying that truth is defined as something between an object, or I'm sorry, not an object, a proposition, and its relationship to how well it describes the reality about which it's making a claim. So like the statement, 2 + 2 = 4. Is that true or is that false? Is that accurate or is that inaccurate? The truth value inheres in its relationship between the proposition and the reality it attempts to describe.
Well, that's where my statement actually goes to a different level than you, because I agree with you that according to the standards that we as humans have, we created this system of mathematics. Maybe there is a metaphysical answer to mathematical questions that is beyond us, and we are simply reaching out and grabbing for the stars, and we correctly grabbed what was true in mathematics. That's possible. But at the same time, it is also entirely possible that our minds are not strong enough to know what real mathematics are. Does that make sense? This is I don't know if I'm explaining this right. Does that make sense? It is entirely okay. Good.
There's definitely the potential for that, and I wasn't using the mathematics example to posit that somehow we have absolute knowledge of all mathematical principles. I was using an example to describe my different conception of truth from yours. That truth isn't a monolithic, static entity, this notion of absolute truth or absolute morality that encompasses the gamut of knowledge, that rather truth is a relationship between a proposition to a reality.
I'd say there's a difference between the concept of absolute truth and the concept of truths that we can know absolutely.
Okay, then I'm just gonna have to stand corrected here. Like in my 4+ years studying philosophy, I've never come across this definition of absolute truth.
Okay, perhaps I am using it incorrectly. So you can have it. You can have it. Doesn't really matter. With what I am describing,
okay.
Do you agree?
I agree that, yeah, a finite being is not going to have absolute certainty about a wide variety of things.
Okay.
Like, so, regardless of whether or not someone believes in God or doesn't believe in God, the fact that we're limited, by our physiology, our mental processing can only encompass so much. We are never going to attain a degree of infinite knowledge. We're limited. I think that's pretty axiomatic.
Okay, so I'm just looking up different definitions of absolute truth right now, and the thing that I think that what I see in all of them is there is a level at which there could be individual truths that are absolute.
Okay.
But there's also the idea of absolute truth as a metaphysical whole. And I think that's the thing that I am questioning, that idea of absolute truth as a whole. And you're focusing specifically on absolute truths. And I don't dissent from the idea that there is at least one absolute truth. So I would agree with you that there is a absolute truth that is knowable. Sure. But I think that since we agree on this, let me just define and make sure that we agree on this. I think both of us would agree that we know we exist in some form or another. We don't know that the other one in front of us, who we're discussing with right now, 100% exists. But based on our rationality, our senses, we can come to certain reasonable degrees of certainty that the other person exists.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. And I think that we would agree that we cannot know that which is infinite. We cannot know all that is moral. No matter how rational we were to become, we would be unable to know all morality.
That's correct.
Okay, there's a cap on all right, cool. So would you consider it reasonable then for humans to point to the existence of absolute truth as a way of saying, I have natural rights, or this is morally acceptable, or this is correct, or this is wrong. Can humans do that? Should humans be able to appeal to such truths, and would it be considered accurate?
Okay, now I see what you're getting at in regard to your definition of absolute truth.
Right.
So if you believe that there is a God, someone that created the universe and then revealed God's self to us, I think that yes, we could say that an appeal to an objective or absolute truth would be considered accurate to a reasonable degree of certainty depending upon the interpretation.
Depending upon the interpretation. But that's where the problem comes in.
I definitely
have a finite interpretation. So we would not be able to know the mind of God. For instance, in religions, there are over 30,000 different denominations of religions, all of which claim to be correct. The fact that every single one of them has a different interpretation tells us our finite minds are not strong enough to comprehend the infinite knowledge that was supposedly granted to us by this infinite creator. Would you agree with that?
Right. I totally agree that there are many different interpretations, and that's why I'm saying I don't think anyone can have 100% total certainty in the interpretation or the existence of certain moral commands. But I do think that pending your religion, there is a reasonable degree of certainty in those things. Does that make sense? And in terms of your 30,000 denominations example, let's not conflate different religions into one overarching category of religions, and acknowledge that the vast majority of those 30,000 denominations are going to agree on a lot of fundamental principles.
A lot of fundamental principles, sure. But okay, so let's say the Christian God is accurate. Let's say he's the right one. There are 33,000, I think it was, last check, of Christian denominations. Every single one of them, they may agree on some fundamental premises, but they disagree on a lot of the interpretation. I would say the reason for this is because of our finite minds, our inability to correctly grasp that which is true. There may be a true or false answer. There may be an absolute truth to everything in the universe. But I would contend that no human being, no matter how great we were to become with our powers of rationality or through our senses, which is all that we have to come to answers, I would contend that no human would be able to know such truth.
Okay, so you don't think there can be different degrees of interpretation? Like we can point to an interpretation and say this interpretation is more accurate than this interpretation.
I do think you can say that. That's why I like to use statistics and percents. How much percent of knowledge can you say? I think if you can get to a certain level, like you used, reasonable degree of certainty, I think that's a good standard for us as humans. I can say to a reasonable degree of certainty that we are definitely having a conversation right now, but I can't say that with absolute certainty, as a statement of absolute truth, that you and I are currently having this conversation.
So then what basis do you use to determine whether or not an interpretation is more or less accurate?
Reasonable degree of certainty.
Okay, so I guess I'm just saying, let's take a verse from scripture John 3:16,
sure,
God so loved, etc. If someone interpreted that to be blue triangles are really cool, that would be a less accurate interpretation than God became incarnate and died for the salvation of the world.
Yes, I would agree with that. Based on what we see and based on the way that we humans use language to interpret John 3:16 as blue triangles are green would be a less valid interpretation. But at the same time, I do have to follow up on this. It is entirely possible, not probable, but it's possible that we humans are completely misusing language, that humans are completely misinterpreting what words actually mean, and what John 3:16 actually means is blue triangles are green. That is possible, not probable, or not in any way certain, but that is one of the infinite possibilities that only an infinite being would be able to answer.
Okay, I mean, this brings up issues of language as a social construct. and us participating in language because we've invented, our own language game. And in 10 minutes, we simply don't have the depth to pursue that tangent. Yes, I think there are possibilities that we may be completely erroneous in our interpretation. However, if we're using the standard of to a reasonable degree of certainty, I think we can know via proper hermeneutics and deconstruction of texts whether or not a particular interpretation is more or less accurate.
I would agree.
And if
that's why we would have this sort of discussion, because you can come to more knowledge through putting one logical point against another.
Right. And if we're presuming that there exists a supernatural divine being who has revealed their person through some kind of manuscript to people, and that with a reasonable degree of certainty we can measure interpretations against this text, then yes, I say that if someone appeals to an absolute truth within the text, it shouldn't be considered accurate on first glance, but via an examination we can determine whether or not it's more or less accurate to a reasonable degree of certainty. But I think you're entirely right that a 100% degree certainty is going to be unattainable as finite beings. I don't think that's problematic, and I think it is feasible to say that absolute truth would be knowable.
What absolute truth do you think? Well, what are we defining again as absolute truth? You're saying individual absolute truths, right? Okay. So what
we have
absolute truths would you say are knowable?
I'm sorry, I was talking and then I realized you were talking. Can you
just sorry. What individual absolute truths would you say are knowable?
Okay, so we've established a couple in the course of this conversation. We've established that saying absolute truth is unknowable would be an absolute truth. So some kind of absolute truths are knowable. We've established that we both exist. So the Cartesian, I think, therefore I am. And I'm back to the whole divine revelation theory. Truths in the text, individual truths conveyed through the text, could be knowable pending the interpretation disagreement.
To a certain level, I think that what most of those come back to is reasonable degree of certainty, as opposed to absolute truth. Though, I think that when we're talking about absolute truth, I think what we were trying to go for more, and obviously we had different definitions, which is part of why it's a little confusing and everything. But just 100% certainty. What things would you say we can know with 100% black and white certainty?
I don't think there are very many, but I also think that's an unreasonable burden for knowability.
Why would you consider that unreasonable? What would be reasonable?
I think we've clarified earlier in this conversation that there are gradients of knowledge. We've got absolute, we've got beyond reasonable doubt, we've got preponderance of the evidence. We utilize each and every single one of these in the courtroom on a daily basis. So
right.
I think that absolute truth is knowable. It all depends upon what your definition of knowable is. And yes, as finite beings, we're not going to grasp the infinity of truth.
Right. Which is what I mean when I say it's unknowable. There may be individual aspects of it that are knowable, but we will not be able to grasp the entire element of it. So which individual aspects of absolute truth do you think we can know? I would agree with you that we can grasp, I think, therefore I am. What else is there that we could know with 100% certainty?
Well, okay, going back to your point, I think the position that you just articulated, that we've sort of come to a consensus on here, that truth is a broader concept than the human mind. There are facets of it that are knowable, facets of it that aren't. Is a position that's going to correspond with practically every worldview. I don't know, maybe you know different Christians than I do. I don't know a Christian who's going to say, yeah, we as humans can grasp the full mind of God. I don't know anyone.
I don't think that any Christians think that. I don't think any of them would say that. But when a Christian, or no, I don't want to sound anti-Christian, when anyone points to there is absolute truth, therefore for you to disagree with abortion is flying in the face of absolute truth. The problem with that is that, as you and I are just verifying here, what they are pointing to is not absolute truth. They're pointing to individual, specific things that human minds can rationally say are true. but that is different than an actual 100% absolute truth.
Okay, yeah, I mean, someone who says abortion is wrong because it violates absolute truth is misusing the concept of absolute truth. Like, the proper permutation of that argument would be abortion is wrong because it violates God's command. Like, that's how the argument should be phrased.
I agree with that, but then it would ultimately appeal to absolute morality, that there is an absolute yes or no on such moral issues. It doesn't have to be specifically abortion, but anyone who appeals to the concept of absolute morality or absolute truth, which I consider to be the same concept, anyone who appeals to that to make their argument is not actually making an argument as much as they are pointing to something that they don't actually have the ability to know.
Well, they don't have the ability to know with 100% certainty.
Sure.
Maybe within the confines of their worldview and their pre-existent logic and evidence that they've mustered for their position, they can know to a reasonable degree of certainty.
I would agree with
in regard to the appeals of objective and absolute truths to not be considered accurate, again, I'll reiterate from an epistemological standpoint, that's appealing to some kind of objective truth that appeals to objective truth shouldn't be considered accurate. To make that appeal as something that's accurate or inaccurate, that we should consider this accurate, is that accurate? Again, that would be self-referentially absurd.
It's the same thing as what we were just talking about, though. It's something that could be known to a reasonable degree of certainty, but it's not something that the fact that you and I would have a difference of opinion would seem to suggest that it isn't 100% provable one way or the other. It's something that both of our minds could be entirely fooled on. If God maybe has a sense of humor and he set up the rules of this universe in a way that, oh, look, you actually can know this, but I'm going to make it so that your minds don't realize you can know this. A clear possibility that he could have done. These are things that are possible, so we can't say that we can know them to 100% certainty.
Right, and you just progressed from book 1 of Descartes' work about I Think Therefore I Am to book 4 or 5 where he talks about the evil demon deceiver. So, yeah, there are possibilities, right, but probabilities are a concern. And I think, in summation of this discussion, I'm not going to call it a debate. It wasn't a debate. It was a good, productive conversation about these things. For the viewers, your stance on this resolution is contingent upon a variety of factors. First of all, whether or not you're perceiving it through a sole epistemological or ethical lens. Secondly, whether you consider absolute truth to be this monolithic entity rather than a series of propositions, truth as an entity rather than a relationship between a proposition and its corresponding reality. And then how many ethical presuppositions you import into this discussion. And then finally, gradients of knowledge. Do we have apodictic certainty or reasonable degree of certainty, that sort of thing?
I would agree with that. And we're coming up on the end here, so I'm glad you summed it up in that way. I think to most levels, I think you and I agree on our positions on this. And I think that the main difference of opinion is just on definitions of absolute truth. So, and honestly, I agree with you on if we accept your definition of absolute truth, I agree with you that there are certain elements of the universe that we could know with absolute truth, or at least one thing we could know with absolute certainty. But the overall thing that I'm going for with this, and I think you would even agree with me on this, is that if someone points to something in the universe, or sorry, I'm making this too far out, just something simple. If someone points to a moral question and says, I know this because absolute truth exists, that is them appealing to something in the wrong way. You said that they shouldn't use that as their argument for abortion. I would agree with you on that. I don't think that appealing to an ethereal absolute truth is the accurate way of framing that argument, which is part of why which is why this resolution is appeals to objective or absolute truth should not be considered accurate, at least according to that version of absolute truth.
Sure. And in regard to that, whether or not you consider it accurate, I think you can weigh it to try to determine whether or not it's a good argument or a bad argument. I don't think that simply because it appeals to absolute truth, on its face means that we should automatically discount it as inaccurate. There's going to be hermeneutics. There's going to be like investigation that needs to be conducted.
Right. It could be the accurate argument. They're just making it the wrong way.
Right. All right. Thank you.